And I just want to lead us into our closing speaker, our keynote speaker, and then I can do the wrap up for the group. Vaughn is kind of the whole package. Vaughn Ton-Quinlivan, she's a nationally recognized thought leader in workforce development. Her career spans the public, the private, the nonprofit sectors. She ran workforce development for Pacific Gas and Electric. She then became executive vice chancellor for workforce and digital futures across the 115 campuses of the California Community College system. She's currently the CEO of Futuro Health, which is a health workforce development joint venture between Kaiser Permanente and its unions. As I said, she's seen this from all different sides. She's most recently published an excellent book called Workforce RX that shares her experiences in building these innovations and gives some best practices from moving forward. She's also won numerous awards, but I got to say something else that you wouldn't see on her resume, which is Vaughn's just a nice person. When I was learning about workforce a few years back, she actually took time to have dinner with me twice. In Palo Alto and then in San Diego at events that were going on. And she challenged the vision I had. She helped me understand what was going to work. She helped me understand where the problems would be and where potential solutions would be. And, even now, a couple of years later, as we're working with the GOI team, as we're doing our workforce project, her advice bounces around my head again. I'm like, oh yeah, Vaughn told me that. So I'm delighted, Vaughn, that you can be with us here. I thank you for being our closing keynote for the day. And I'll hand it over to you to talk.
So George, thank you for giving me the opportunity to close out the day today. I think these wicked problems lend to a conversation where, how do we bring best practices to bear so that we don't start from scratch, because we need to go faster and further than before. So a little bit about my background. I came from the private sector, then the public sector, and now the nonprofit sector. From the private sector, I did, like many of you, was solving the workforce issue for the company of 20,000, brought that from having no opinion to becoming a nationally recognized best practice. But part of that was determining how far can I push the design of the workforce solution that I had put in place to better understand, does it hold if we went from this occupation to this occupation, from this geography to this geography, from sub-baccalaureate trained occupations to bachelor or master's trained occupations. So part of what the opportunity that everybody on this call has now is to test the edges of the best practices that they're putting in place as they do programs. And then I was appointed by the governor to drive the workforce mission of the largest system of higher education, and that's the community college system of California, which has 116 institutions. And so we was able to bring that from having roughly about 100 million in discretionary funds, but through applying a set of best practices, we were then able to grow it to 200 million to 700 million to over $1 billion, because we were able to reprioritize workforce from an afterthought to a policy priority. And that can only be done if you're beginning to weave a lot of best practices together. And now I'm in Futuro Health, and we're a nonprofit that is bringing all of these and combining these best practices in a novel way in order to tackle the healthcare workforce shortage, especially the allied health roles. 65% of the healthcare workforce are these allied health roles, and we need them. Everybody needs them, proportional share of workers in our backyard. So just a few thoughts, because I think I'm one of the rare birds, as George mentioned, that has moved from the private sector to public sector, nonprofit, and did experiments in all three sectors to see how can we go bolder, how do we solve some of these wicked problems. So I'd like to just share a few thoughts. The first is, if you're tackling these workforce issues, know that it is a team sport, not an individual sport. So I'll say it again, it's a team sport, not an individual sport. And at the crux of workforce development are three sets of players coming together in order to create that economic mobility that we all desire, inclusive economic mobility that we all desire. And each of these parties need to do what they do best and not try to do everything. And that's a misconception by many employers, for example, that they have to do everything. So the employers, what should they do best? They should focus on articulating what they need and then hiring. On the education side, what do they do best? They should close the gap between the population and then what the employers need. You know, we talked a lot about credential skills, all of that good stuff. And then the third party are the community-based organization or workforce boards who can go out in the community much more deeply, screen for candidates that meet the criteria of the employers, and case manage them. And I want to just share how the three combine together by conveying what I call my fish story. So when I was with the energy company of 20,000, we did all this, right? We had put together a program that involved all of these three players. There was a young gentleman, 19-year-old man named Aleki, who was in this workforce development program, seated at a college. And our supervisor was super excited that he was moving through and was expecting that he would come out on the other side once he went through the pre-employment testing. We were hoping that he would be on the list because he seemed like he would be such a good fit for the company. Well, it turns out that Aleki went fishing when he was 15, and Aleki caught a fish that was too small. And as a result, he got a ticket. And as a 15-year-old, he did not pay the ticket, and then the ticket went to court. Well, as a 15-year-old, he did not show up in court. So Aleki had a felony on his record. He did not know he had a felony. And so as an employer, what would have happened to Aleki? He would have applied for as many jobs as he wanted, but he would have just gotten the thank you, but no thank you card. We have other candidates that we're considering, right? It's not really the role of employers to work through all of those issues. Is it education's work? Well, education could have given him the certificate, the associate's degree, the bachelor's degree, the master's degree, it didn't matter. He was blocked from employment because of that record. And it actually took the third leg, which is the community-based organization. They were the ones, as case managers, to work with him to expunge his record so that the employer could have hired him. And so it was a good story at the end, but really that's why the three-legged stool works best when all three parties are involved, because none of us can do all of that on our own. So it is a team sport, not an individual sport. The second point I wanted to make is a down economy is a great opportunity because that's the moment when you can bring collaboration together in novel ways. You know, when I was in private sector trying to solve some of our skills issue, I thought, wow, why can't we get more investments into these programs? When I moved over to the public sector, I realized, my goodness, there's a ton of resources moving through at the federal level, at the state level, philanthropy, even corporate resources. They just often function as a silo. Instead of braiding and building upon each other's effort, they all sorted from scratch. And so part of the advantage of a down economy is that as we're resource constrained, we need to figure out who are all the assets, who are all the players in the landscape, and build upon the collective work rather than think that we are the only ones. So doing that environmental scan, stakeholder scan, asset scan, is connecting the dots will allow each of us to move much further than on our own. The third aha that I had was that some experiments are best done outside of government as proof of concept and then can be amplified by government. So for example, digital badging, which all of us know really well, there was a point in time it was supported by Mozilla as an experiment. And when I was joined the California Community College, nobody knew what digital badging was. And so what we wanted to do was solve the soft skills problem because employers were complaining about it, but also insert an experiment, and which was, let's begin to play with digital badging and whether these soft skills can be badged in this way. So there was the first introduction of digital badging into the system. And we did it through a grant that said, okay, whoever wins this needs to have 10 colleges coming together, agreeing on the curriculum that the employers want. But as you do this curricular work, we want you to incorporate digital badging. And so that experiment went from 10 colleges to 20 colleges to 60 colleges to 85 colleges, and rode this adoption curve, and it was seeded in a very intentional way. So government can amplify in such a great way, but it's not great in terms of the initial experimentations. And then the last point that I wanted to make was, many of us get our stripes by creating companies, solving the problems from an academic or other or employer seats or community seats. And I would like to put out there that as you learn what the best practices are, and as you iterate on what these best practices are, consider stepping into a civic role at some point in time. Because in the roles, especially the ones where you're leading state agencies or setting policies that shape the flow of money and shape of the resources, you are able to change behavior of institutions and therefore affect many, many more lives than if you're on the periphery with a program solution. So I hope that especially those of you with data skills or technology skills, those of you who are developing insights on how to effectively create economic mobility and reskill individuals, you will bring that talent into these civic roles at state government, federal government, local government, because we can only go as far as the skill sets within the leadership of in these roles. So I highly encourage all of you to consider the steps that I had taken, which allowed me to bring many of these best practices from the private sector into the public sector and now into the nonprofit sector. So let me pause right there, and those are some learnings. There are many, many more. I had the chance to do a pandemic project, which was to write some of these best practices down in a book called Workforce RX, and invite you to read that. Or I have a podcast that's free that invites national leaders who are really thinking about the future of work, the future of learning, the future of healthcare, to share their latest thoughts. And that's available anywhere where you listen to podcasts. So let me pause there and see if George, do you want to come back onto the screen?
Sure. Yeah. I'll leave my camera off because you're talking, but I'll ask you the questions anyway. Please, anybody that has any questions, put them in the Q&A channel, but certainly there are plenty of other questions. One of the questions I have is, you've been in a number of sectors, and every sector, of course, feels like the grass is greener in the other sectors. So you're in healthcare, and in healthcare, we hear that healthcare is the place to do this. So what do you think? What is it about the healthcare context that makes this either a better place or a more challenging place to do the kind of work you're doing in workforce development?
Your question makes me laugh, because when I was in the energy sector, they said, "Oh, we're so unsexy. Why don't we say that we're in the water sector?" And and the water sector said, "Well, we're so unsexy. Let's call ourselves market ourselves some different way." Healthcare is interesting because there's so much credentials, and it's a great place to figure out instructional design and how you create stackable credentials that facilitate economic mobility. So, for example, we have an aftermath of the COVID pandemic, which is the mental health, behavioral health pandemic. So behavioral health means, alcohol, depression, drug use, for example. The shortage is at the master's level, and that's a very, very far distance for people to go when for an education. So how do you begin to bring in communities into high volume roles, like less than a year, right? So a certificate or credential, and into their first job, and then you begin to place chutes and ladder, move them into associate degrees like a drug counselor, or to the bachelor of social work, or to a bachelor plus master's, in order to get them into those therapy roles. I think so. healthcare is a great place where there's a lot of structure around the credentials. And what's also fantastic about this moment in time, as painful as it is that the pandemic unlocked a lot of good options, quality options in the virtual environment in education, right? Whether it's hybrid or fully virtual, as long as it has live student support. And so now you're able to combine in novel ways and not just limited to what is in your backyard. So I call this the sort of the unbundling and rebundling of education. You know, a person can start with soft skills in one institution, go to the technical skills in another institution, and at a later point, go for their next stack in the credential at a third institution. So that is all being facilitated by the pandemic that did not exist previously.
Wow. So nice opportunity to come out of the pandemic with all the other bad things that have happened. And you'd mentioned also the recession, same thing, that, you know, if a recession comes on, that may actually be an opportunity rather than the big challenge that, of course, it'll be in many cases. Boy, I've got so many other questions to share. One of the things is, you know, many times it can be a very daunting task to make these changes happen, right? So, you know, finding educators that want to do this program for your company, finding companies that want to work with the educators, being an ed tech and getting anybody to listen to you at all. What advice do you have for somebody who's just trying to start this, that just feels like they're banging their head against the wall? What do you think? How do you get this done?
I think, George, you're asking like what unlocks our individual superpowers, right?
Okay.
Because it's only when it's unlocked then you can go the distance. Because yes, there's a lot of resistance, a lot of drama as you try to make change. I have to share that, you know, back in 1975, my family escaped from the Vietnam War. My father back in Vietnam was a neurosurgeon, and he couldn't do that here in the United States. And my mother was a teacher, which is very venerable occupation, and she couldn't do that here in the United States. And so you would think my parents would be very bitter, but instead they were always grateful. And they said, Vaughn, we're never going to give you stuff because stuff can be taken away, alluding to the war. Instead, we're going to give you your education because nobody can take that away. And so I do the work that I do because I want to pay forward that same opportunity that I had. And so that is what unlocks my superpower. When I am touching that work to give somebody their opportunity and break through with education, then I'm able to go the distance. When I'm not touching that space, my superpowers don't appear. So it's really quite fascinating.
Oh, very interesting. Hey, so I've got one other question for you then. One superpower you've done is, as an electrical engineer by training, I would call it impedance matching, but I think you'd probably call it matching supply and demand. So we had, you know, you have to fill a classroom in order to offer a course, but each employer might only do one or two, or each employer, you know, might have a big demand, but it can't be met by one provider. Can you give some more examples there? You shared one or two, but how have you done that impedance matching? How have you found that way to match the supply and demand and make these labor markets work?
George, I call this the issue of the fire hose and the garden hose. Sorry, there's some background noise here. And I discovered this when I was in the private sector. And I couldn't find a solution, articulate the solution until I actually went over to higher education. So think about how higher education works. There's an economics, right? They have to fill a classroom of 25. And if you have less than 15, if you have less than 15, for example, you have to cancel the course. Everybody who here on the line who is a faculty knows exactly that, right? So there's an economics of education. Well, so I call that the fire hose. And those 25 students go through the education program. They all come out at the same time in the same month. Well, what happens on the job side? The job side is more of a garden hose. They drip out one job, drip out two jobs, drip out three jobs of the same kind. Well, that's very uninteresting to education, right? And no company drips out 25 of the same job at the same time. So there's a mismatch between what employers need and how education needs to operate. So a solution I found to that was really pooling jobs. What does that mean? That means, like, as an employer, I have a supply chain. Those companies that are in my supply chain may have a similar occupation, like have the similar role. Can I batch them all up so that I can fill up a class? Can I work with the trade association to aggregate? Can I even work with competitors? We will collaborate at the beginning in order to create the talent pool, and we'll compete at the point of hiring. So collaborate at the beginning, compete at the end. So these are ways in which you can aggregate and pull up jobs. And what happens when you start pulling the jobs? Well, all of a sudden you become so much more interesting to play with for education. So now at Futuro Health, because we're aggregating the volume of jobs, we have educators coming to us and saying, well, you know what, we don't really have to start in January and in June and in September. We'll decouple from the academic calendar. We'll start in February too, and March, and May, April, and May. All of a sudden it becomes much more responsive to the need of adults, because adults don't like to sit around, you know, the moment of their interest. They don't want to wait till the fall to get started. So you begin to get a set of solutions that is very different when you start rethinking this fundamental dilemma of the garden hose and the fire hose.
Wonderful. So you just answered a question that just came in, and so we can consider that one answered. And I've got one that was texted to me, and then one that we can close with. The one that was texted to me is, labor and management don't always like each other. And here you are in a joint venture between them. So what are you learning about the perspectives, given the fact that you're working with these people on a regular basis, both sides, in this new nonprofit?
Well, as I said, workforce development is a team sport and not an individual sport. And I think there's an opportunity for unusual collaborators. What happened here was, there's a gap of 500,000 allied health care workers needed just alone in the state of California. And as I mentioned, every state has the same dilemma, because 65% of the healthcare workforce are these allied health roles. And so what our union founder was willing to do was trade off some other things, and the two, as part of the collective bargaining agreement, agreed to set aside a pot of money in order to create a nonprofit that grew the next generation of healthcare workers. So again, very unusual allies coming together, really, because this is a team sport, not an individual sport.
That's great. So let me just close with one final question, and certainly one that you can probably answer that I can't, which is, a lot of women look to you as a successful women executive, as a kind of a superhero to follow. And so what leadership tips do you have for women leaders and founders who would consider you as a reference point?
Oh, that's very generous, George. I am the best beneficiary of a lot of other women who have passed down their, knowledge. I will tell you, I was trained, at Stanford at graduate school. I did the, dual masters, the business school side and the education policy. We spent a lot of time learning how to do our profession, all of us, right? Navigating how professions intersect with the personal life, there's no playbook for that, other than understanding the stories of those who went ahead and what are the issues they face in navigating the personal professional intersection. And I think that's been the most valuable thing that happened to me when I was selected for a mid-career program called the International Women's Forum Fellows Program. And in that program, I was in my 30s. There were other women in their 40s, and they shared and passed along what were the helpful tips for their success, but the peaks and the valleys. And I think the more that we can speak and learn from those ahead of us, just like I'm sharing in workforce development, there are some best practices developed. We don't have to start from scratch. I did not start from scratch because these women passed on their learnings to me.
Well, thank you. And thank you for passing on your learning to the group of us. I really appreciate everything you've done over the years, and I really appreciate you being here for our launch to energize us as we finish up our launch event. So with that, I'll let you go, and then we'll just do a closing session. Thank you very much.